Shalom CBINT. Rabbi Alter here to say that you can't come to Shul tonight, tomorrow, even if you want to. Nope, we are gathering virtually this evening at 5:45, again tomorrow night at 8 o'clock for Havdalah. Otherwise, this is a Shabbat in our homes, whether we live alone or whether we live with family or others. This is a Shabbat that we're going to create in our interior spaces. This is a new experience, a challenging experience, but as I'm going to teach now, I think it's also an experience ripe with opportunity for creativity. In this week's Parshiyot, Vayakhel and Pekudei, the last two of the book of Exodus, we read of the assembly of the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary where we worshipped in the wilderness. And after reading about all the materials and the design for the Mishkan and all of its furnishings, all of its elements, in this week's Parshiyot, everything comes together. All the materials are brought and everything is assembled, constructed precisely according to design and made ready for use. Indeed, we read in chapter 36 that the people begin to bring all of the sacred materials, the gold and the silver and the copper and the fine linen and the blue and the crimson and the purple threads, the yarn and tanned skins and oil and spices, everything according to God's order, everything according to the vision given to Moses, from Moses to Bezalel and Oholiav, his craftsmen, and the crew who worked with them. We read in chapter 36 that the people were bringing everything. And they, every morning, they woke up and they said, let's bring more. I've got this, and I can bring that, and I can donate that. Every morning they were bringing more and more until Oholiav and Bezalel finally said to Moses, we've got too much. We have more than we need in order to accomplish this project. We have too much material. So Moshe sends out an order in the camp, no more, stop bringing materials. And in chapter 36, verse 7, we read that the people's efforts to bring sacred materials, Haita dayam l'chol hamlacha la'asot ota. Haita dayam, dalid yud mem. Dayam is related to the word we know so well from Pesach, dayenu. It is enough. It would have been enough. So dayam, their efforts were sufficient. Day, they were adequate to the task. L'chol hamlacha. And then it says vehoter. They were adequate to the task. Indeed, they were more than adequate. Vehoter, from the word yoter, too much. The Kedushat Levi, the great Hasidic commentator and teacher, that's Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, he says, wait a second. It was sufficient and it was too much. Either it's sufficient or it's too much. How can it be both? And he explains that there's an analogy here to God, right? So the whole Mishkan is understood in the Torah and elaborated on by commentators, but it is clearly understood in the Torah to be a miniature world. That is to say that just as God in 6 days created a world, so we, in building the Mishkan according to God's design, so we create a world. And just as God occupies the world by sanctifying the seventh day, by sanctifying Shabbat, so we create a space for God a space for God to dwell in by creating a sanctuary for God. Right? So there's a clear parallel between God's creative efforts in creating the world and our creative efforts in assembling the Mishkan. Okay, so what the Kedushat Levi says about God is that God has this creative capacity that is boundless because God is boundless, and that if God had given free rein to God's own creative capacity, in a sense, God would have filled the world and left no room for the world, left no room for us. That God's creative capacity would, in a sense, have smothered the very world that God intended to create. And so God had to say to himself, Dayo, it is enough. I, in my creative efforts, cannot extend myself fully. I need to halt. I need to contain and constrain my creative efforts so that there's room for the world that I'm trying to create. And in having constrained themselves and left room for the world, here we are. The world as we know it exists in all of its bounty. This right now we're seeing some of the scariness of the world, but we're focused right now on the blessing of the world on its fullness. And what the Kedushat Levi says is that in constraining God's own creative capacity, God leaves room for our own creative capacity. God makes it possible for us to add to the world that God has created, hoter, for us to supplement, for us to add into, contribute to the world that God has created, right? But with our own creative capacities. So what does this teach us for this Shabbat? Number one, in the disorienting reality that we find ourselves in with this isolation, many of us, I think, are probably moved to impose order on our newly disordered lives. And remember that God, in creating the world, is imposing order on the chaos, on the tohu vavohu that preceded creation. And I think there's a message here that we need to recognize that if we try to control everything, if we try to impose order on everything, we will smother it. That this is the new reality, and we cannot allow ourselves frantically to try to impose order on everything. That the disorder is part of the nature of our lives right now, or more closely in line with the Kedushat Levi's teachings, that if we give endless, boundless free rein to our impulse for order, it will be too much. It will be smothering. And the second is the biggest surprise, and that is that once we constrain ourselves, recognize that we cannot fill all of the space of our homes, all of the space of our disordered lives with our ordering instinct, if we allow things to be, which is, of course, the call of Shabbat, to allow things to be as they are and not to try to fix and repair and order them, that we may be surprised by what creativity emerges. The creativity of our spirit, the creativity of our kindness, the creativity of our good humor, the creativity of our love, of our poetic sense. And so the hoter, let this be for us a Shabbat of hoter. Let this be for us a Shabbat where we bring ourselves spontaneously and creatively and beautifully and originally into these challenging, novel circumstances that describe our lives and the lives of people all over the world as we contend with this coronavirus. So for all of us, I wish a Shabbat of order, yes, of beauty, of creativity, of spontaneity, and in keeping with the ultimate message of the assembly of the Mishkan in the wilderness, according to God's design, a Shabbat of fulfillment. To all of you, Shabbat Shalom. We'll see you this evening at 5:45 and tomorrow night at 8. Shabbat Shalom.